So now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to basically turn this over to Chris Lysy. Chris has been working with data for close to 2 decades, holding a master's in sociology. He has held roles as a data analyst and a data visualization expert. He has also taken on roles in data management and IT systems development. In addition to information design consulting and training, Chris runs a virtual workshop teaching contemporary 21st century reporting and data design. So thank you so much for joining us, Chris. We're so excited to learn with you. And again, thanks to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, Katie. And so if you have questions as we go, please feel free to use that chat. Katie and Kat are going to be hanging around with us, which is fantastic. So for the first time in like forever, I'm on a Zoom call where I don't also have to be doing the tech support. So this is fantastic. So if anything goes wrong, you can talk to them, and I'll just go on oblivious to anything happening. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm looking forward to this session. So this is a session that's near and dear to my heart, but I guess it's still a little early for a lot of evaluators. So it might be something new for some of you, for many of you. I'm not sure who else is calling it UX evaluation, but because when it comes down to it, this little secret, UX design is really a form of evaluation, but don't tell anybody I told you that. That's a secret between us. But there's just so much evaluation in UX design. So it's really just a different set of methods, but we will get into that. So I'm Chris. Basically, I'm one part evaluator, one part designer. I do them both. And this is how I like to see it. Evaluation and design are kind of like two sides of the same coin. Without design, you don't have evaluation because there's nothing to evaluate. And without evaluation, design is just doing stuff. So, so you kind of need both. In order to create things, useful things, try to make things better. Otherwise, you're just doing a bunch of random stuff and hoping things work and not knowing if you're making things better or worse. I'm also a cartoonist. So you'll see this you'll probably get a sense of that as we go. If you don't know anything about any of my work, that's fine. You'll see a bunch of my cartoons here because I apparently can't create a presentation or a workshop or anything without putting in a whole bunch of cartoons. But first, let's start with a story. So this right here is my favorite cartoon. I'll tell you why in a second, but it's very basic. At the beginning of every evaluation, on one side, the one person goes, I know our project works, and the other person says, no, you don't. And so this was really there to kind of point out a tension that I would see between program people and evaluators that I would see kind of like often in my career. And what I like about it is if I show this to a group of evaluators, this is usually the response. Oh, that's so mean. I mean, it's true, but it's a little harsh. And, taking the vantage point of this one person on the right. And then if I show it to a bunch of program people, the nerve, of course, the project person knows more than the evaluator. And you get this kind of conversation started. And what I found interesting is that if you don't have the conversation around the cartoon, somebody might take it really personally, or they won't see the other side. They'll just see it from their vantage point. But that's why it's my favorite cartoon. And the other reason I showed this cartoon to my mom, and my mom's, I guess she spent 3 decades working in family literacy, early childhood. She would go around to houses where I grew up in Carroll County, Maryland, and work with families with young children on, I guess, getting GEDs, working with families, getting kids enrolled in certain services. It was kind of a running joke that my mom had kids all over town because everywhere you go, she'd have former participants, project participants that that were in her program that she was family literacy person for. And when I showed her that cartoon, that she took a second, she got like really quite annoyed. And and I asked her to tell me why. What was she thinking when she saw that cartoon? And what it brought up for her is that early on, the one of the first programs that she started in the early 90s. It was still kind of new for a lot of family literacy programs. So there was a lot of churn and change in terms of the program that they were using in the county that she lived in and she worked in. So they'd have a program for a couple of years, then it would change up, and then it would become a different program that would get funded, same dollars. It would just become a different set of things that she was doing. And so at one point, one of the early programs she had, she loved the program. She thought it was really helpful to the people that she was working with, to the family she was working with. And then later, they came in and they changed up the program again. And this time they had a program that was evidence-based. Like they have a whole bunch of data and evidence that says this is a good program, this is a working program. But for her, she didn't think it was that good, not compared to the old program. And when she saw the cartoon, that's what she thought of. That these evaluators, from her experience, came in and they changed a program that worked to a program didn't work quite as well, just because they said they have the data to support that it works better, that it's evidence-based compared to the other program that she felt was the superior program. And so I start with this program because we're talking about evaluation, and everybody talks about evaluation make things better. Evaluation is about making sure you're not doing the wrong things. Evaluation is about project improvement, program improvement. But sometimes evaluation is just proving to everybody else what you already know. By going through something systematically, objectively, to kind of just connect the data to something that works, whether or not anybody else recognizes it now. Good evidence can help sustain a good program. Alternatively, a lack of evidence can limit a good program's growth. And in the case of my mom, it can also see a program go away. They were early on, they didn't really collect a lot of data or evidence to support that initial program. So when the program that had a little bit more evidence behind it came in, it became the choice. And like it or not, there are reasons to think through on both sides of that. But before we dive in, just curious, how many people here are kind of program people, project people, or evaluators? If you could just in the chat, like, what's your role? Are you on the program side? Maybe both. There are a lot of program people who do evaluation. There are a lot of evaluators who do program stuff. Evaluation, both. Evaluation. Okay, dabble in. Project, program manager, both. Project, okay. I'm curious, for the people coming in, that cartoon I showed before, did it resonate on one side or the other? Was it surprising to think that somebody would have a different viewpoint of that cartoon? Okay, I'm a program person doing projects at times. Totally got the cartoon. I'm curious, Marnie, if you could come off mute just for a second. And it's okay if you can't. What did you see when you saw that cartoon before?
I saw reality in that. Whereas, yeah, I do think there's the need for that mix of clinical expertise and gut feeling kind of combined with needing to prove it. And there's not always people don't always see both sides.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Here, I'm gonna go back just for a second. So the people who missed the cartoon, here it is again. And thank you, Marnie. I appreciate that. So that's really one of the reasons. So a lot of times with my cartoons, I like to try to go right at the tension kind of point because it's more interesting. Problems, questions, challenges, they're more interesting things to cartoon. They're also more interesting things to get conversation started with. But sorry for everybody who is now experiencing a little too much going forward. All right. So now I probably don't have to talk this through to a lot of you because there are a lot of evaluators in this room, which is cool. It's nice being able to talk to a bunch of evaluators, and program people too. But I think before we can dive into talking about UX evaluation, I think it's useful just to take a really oversimplified look at program design. And when I say this is kind of like the cartoon perspective, oversimplified. But I think it can be useful, especially given we have an hour and a half. So diving into concepts, sometimes taking that focused approach works. So let's talk about program design. For me, I think program design is all about actions and consequences. So we talk about outputs and outcomes and activities and inputs and all sorts of other things. But I think when you really try to break it down to its most basic level, I think we're talking about actions and consequences. And, it's important that you have actions and consequences because that's what allows us to do something to cause something else to happen, to have some kind of consequence, to have some kind of outcome or impact. So having an action leads to some kind of consequence. And so I've used this a bunch. Anytime I do like a model or something, baby first logic model, I cry, action, mommy and daddy appear, consequence, right? It's so you have the action on one side, consequence on the other. Simplified logic model, give us money, everybody wins. Give us money, action, consequence, everybody wins. So that's great. Input, output, outcome. Sip a good cup of coffee. That's an action. The consequence is that deliciousness that you feel if you like coffee. My wife does not like coffee, so she would not believe that would be true. So that would not be the consequence she would have. She would spit it out probably. It's Christmas time. We're coming up to the holidays. Gifts are just outputs. They're actions. We're giving somebody a gift. The outcomes are the feelings, the experiences that we have through the gift giving holiday, the other stuff that goes around it. So actions, consequences. And that's what we're talking about a lot of times when we're looking at program design. And I like to put it like this. Okay, just simply actions, consequences. So we're going to use that research library on the YouthREX site. Go through a couple examples. So these are some of the reports. So the emphasis on using extrajudicial measures to divert first-time or less serious from nonviolent offenders away from the criminal justice system has successfully shifted the focus of the youth justice system from being more punitive to being more rehabilitative. Action, using extrajudicial measures. So pushing for that is going to change the system consequence from being punitive to rehabilitative. So that's the overall thought. There are all sorts, remember we're oversimplifying because there are all sorts of caveats here and all different places we can go. And if we're creating a logic model, we go a lot deeper, or a theory of change, we'd expand everything out a little bit. Okay, this report provides information for youth sport programmers and practitioners, particularly those working with youth facing barriers, on how to deepen the impact of sport programs by intentionally structuring these programs to support psychosocial development. In this line, which part is the action? And I'm going to give you lots of quizzes. Well, maybe not lots. Depends how bored you get. If you get bored doing quizzes, I'll stop giving quizzes. Anyone have any thoughts?
Sports programs?
Intentionally structuring these programs, sports programs. Okay. I'll show you what I think. And that's what I thought too, Renee, that here we have structuring these programs to support psychosocial development is the action. The consequent is to deepen the impact of the sports programs. So it's kind of flipped. And sometimes we'll see that when you go into a report. I'm just going in the back ways. These are like research reports, research practice reports. So they're not always straight up. It's not just a simple intervention that we're looking at. But basically, I find that sometimes just breaking down what it is we're doing, whether it's our entire program or just a small little chunk of it, a little piece of it that we want to evaluate and make better. First, we need to kind of understand what's our action and what consequences that action going to be leading towards. So here's a question for you. I want you to think about your own work right now. And I want you to kind of come up with your own action and consequence pair. And so I have a question. Hi, Chris. How do you differentiate consequences, outcomes with goals of the program? So I would say a goal sometimes is bigger than any individual consequence or outcome. So the goal of the program might be some kind of large mega consequence, because you can break these things down really small. Like a goal of an email might be to get people to register for a webinar so that they attend the webinar. And so the more you think of the consequences, usually the outcomes usually are things that change about the people, things that are not things that are just easy to count, but are the bigger changes that we're going for, the things that we're trying to accomplish. Sometimes there's a lot of overlap between a program's goals and the outcomes that their desired outcomes. Sometimes a little bit more nebulous. Usually people, when they write out goals, they're a little bit more generic than when they write out specific outcomes that they might be able to measure. So that's usually how I differentiate. Usually I would go for consequences are things that you could probably measure in some way or figure out how to measure. Goals sometimes are harder to do that from an organization's perspective. So I'm curious, has anyone taken a shot to think about their own program and what actions lead to what consequences? And then a follow-up, if so, would you be willing to chat with me about it or walk through your program with me? No problem. Of course I can, Simran. The idea is I want you to think about your own work, a project that you're working on, a program that you're working with, and think about what actions are part of that program and what are the consequences that are supposed to come from those actions. A lot involve education and changes in practice. Aline, would you mind coming off mute for a second and just talking me through that?
Not at all. I was just thinking that a lot of the projects I'm evaluating right now have to do with capacity building in different professional groups around different areas. And the outcome would be that the participant would feel that they have the knowledge and the skills and the confidence to provide better services to different population groups.
Right. So you have the action would be some kind of capacity building activity. And then that built confidence would be the consequence. That makes sense.
No, I wouldn't say, I mean, it would be a range of things. It wouldn't just be confidence. It would be,
of course.
I use the word practice, but it would be a combination of knowledge, skills, and confidence. So we would be measuring different consequences.
Right. Because it can get really like the more you dive into it, the more elaborate it gets, the more we can break out. When you oversimplify, sometimes it just takes something that's not entirely accurate, but it creates a way that we can talk about it and then kind of break out and expand upon it. But no, that makes sense, Celine. Thank you. Action, asking your manager what her favorite book is. Consequence, learning that she has published a lot of works, but it's available for reading in her course, Research Methods 101. Action, asking. Henry, do you want to talk more about your little story there? And this beginning part is the part where I try to see if anybody actually wants to talk, or if you just want to hear me talk. Go ahead, Henry.
Can everyone hear me or no?
I can hear you.
Oh, thanks, Chris. Yeah, so I was thinking, let's suppose you work in a group and you do evaluation like I do. And so you're kind of wondering, well, what is my manager's favorite book? So she tells you, you know, if you're like me, you've completed at least a bachelor's of education, but your manager might have her PhD or she might have her master's. And so she might say, well, I've published a lot of books, but if you take one of my courses, for example, Research Methods 101, there's something I talk about here. And if you take the course, you check the works cited or the bibliography page at the back, you'll find out that her favorite book is actually something that she's written. So I'm thinking that's the consequence. You learn a little bit about research, you learn a little bit about evaluation, because she's pretty much telling you, right, that there's a book. It doesn't give you what it is, but
it's interesting, because it's actions and consequences are not always straightforward one-to-one.
Yeah, exactly.
Now the question is that a desired consequence? Now it's let me tie this around. I won't keep you on, Henry. You can go off mute if you'd like. Because I think one of the things you might be thinking of actions and consequences. So when we talk about our process evaluation or outcome evaluations, that when we're looking at the actions, when we're looking at the things that we're doing, and the things like the specific things that we're doing, and we're monitoring that's more of our process evaluation. When we're looking at the consequences, that's our outcome evaluation. And the consequences are usually the things that we're really trying to make come around. That's the change that we're trying to make in this world, are the little changes or the little changes in people's experiences that we're trying to make. I think it's also important that we talk about evaluation lag. Now, I used to work out of a co-working space in North Carolina called the Frontier, and it was a free co-working space. So not only did it have a bunch of entrepreneurs and startup small businesses and consultants like myself, it also had a good number of startup nonprofits, brand new, just getting going. And thinking about nonprofits, you can talk to them about evaluation. The startup nonprofits who have very little time, they have a whole lot of stuff that they're trying to get done. And if you start talking about evaluation too early, that's when evaluators want to talk about evaluation, when it's way earlier than the programs tend to want to talk about evaluation. But the idea is that sometimes people are a little bit too busy, that they don't really feel like they're ready to talk about evaluation right now. And part of that is because of how because of how nonprofits get going and how projects get going. Most of the time, unless you're in a big government organization that can fund evidence-based programs that already exist, most of the time the programs that are coming into existence, programs that you're working with, start because of some kind of problem that they're trying to solve, or some kind of opportunity. Maybe there's grant funding for students to work on certain projects of things they care about, or they just have some idea of how they can make the world a better place. The thing about that is they might not have an action or a consequence. They might not have it fully figured out yet. They have a problem. They don't have the solution yet. They're trying to work towards a solution. Maybe they have ideas about how to get to that solution. So this tends to be where the startup people end up. Then there are the thing is, then even if you do have actions and consequences and you figure it out and you have your intervention, you have your activities, and everything's kind of like set out for you, all of a sudden you have something like COVID and it changes context. Now all of a sudden that program, that in-person meeting that you've been planning for months needs to go virtual, and the context completely changes, and the activities that you had planned, they're just not going to work like you have them set up. So how do you evaluate in these kind of experiences? And usually what happens is we just push off evaluation, or not the evaluators. Evaluators don't push off the evaluation, but the program people would. But if evaluation could take less time, responded to change in context, and you didn't need to wait until your intervention was truly ready to evaluate, that would be different, right? And that's UX design. UX design for me is a form of evaluation. But we should talk about what UX design is, and then how it kind of flips into UX evaluation. I'll show you too, because I think we can use these in way more than just software development, website development, that kind of thing. I think we can use it, especially early on some of our programs when we're trying to develop something a little bit more innovative, or when we're trying to kind of course correct or adapt a certain program as we go. So in the beginning of the web, computer engineers made really ugly websites because they required a lot of code, but the people who did a lot of code, they didn't necessarily know the right color combinations, they didn't know kind of how people's mind work, the aesthetic quality. If you go back to early website or web design, it's pretty ugly. Then they decided to integrate more graphic designers. Okay, let's make these websites less ugly. But there's a problem, is that a website can both be functional and pretty, but still not useful. Useful is different than the aesthetic quality and the functionality. And thus a profession was born, and that is the profession of UX design. And the UX designer, their role on a web development piece is to work with both the graphics people, the visual people, and the backend people, the computer engineers and that kind of thing, but with the frustrated user in mind. It's a change of perspective. You're not just trying to create something functional or pretty, you're trying to create something useful. In order to create something useful, you need to do a lot of evaluation. You need to understand what are the needs of the person using a website. So it's kind of like the LoreX, but instead of trees, a UX designer will speak for the users. Now, why does this matter? Of course, everybody wants something to work better. They want a nice designed website. But it's not just that. Computer programmers, computer engineers, if you go down that career path, there are a lot of jobs available for those kinds of positions, and they usually make pretty good money. But the problem is, if you put a computer engineer to a task, you try to get them to develop a functional system, they can do that. But if it's not the right thing and they have to go back and redevelop it every time you talk to a new manager, it gets a little tedious, and actually it just takes more and more time. So what people have found over time is that if you integrate evaluation in the form of a user experience designer, the time it takes to create something useful goes down. So you can create something useful faster. And this is the business case for user experience design, is that by integrating a user experience design process, hiring a user experience designer, a software company can make a more useful product faster and with less revisions and that kind of thing. So there are different books that kind of kicked off UX design. Don Norman, who used to work for Apple back in the day and kind of is pointed at a lot of times as being the one who kind of kicked off the profession of UX design. He has this book, The Design of Everyday Things, that on the front cover is like the devil's coffee pot. I forget what it's called, but you'll notice the handle is right underneath the spout. So if you try to pour it, it's going to pour hot liquid on your hand. So the idea is it might look okay, but it is completely not useful. And then Steve Krug, who is talking a lot about website usability, came out with his book, Don't Make Me Think. And it's another, they're interesting books, and there are a lot of interesting user experience design books that are really easy to pick up and read. Basically, right now, user experience, a lot of times is really, the field itself is associated a lot with software design, web design, and with business purposes. It doesn't have to be, but this is Don Norman and Jacob Nielsen. Their definition is that it encompasses all aspects of the end user's interaction with the company, its services, and its products. There's this other thing, which is UI. You'll often see UX get paired with UI. And when you pair UX and UI, they're not really the same thing. User experience is more on the user research. You use personas, you do testing, you're doing wireframes, you're setting it up, how things are going to look. The user interface is the actual thing that people are using. So when I talk about UX evaluation, I'm not really talking about the interface. We're not designing interfaces for programs. We're looking at how people use these programs and the experiences they have. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of human-centered design. I find that there's a lot of similarities between UX design, human-centered design. There's this website, designkit.org. If you're looking for fun methods for doing things like brainstorming, for doing data collection, you go here at designkit.org. They have tons of methods that you can just pick up. They're really short descriptions about how to use them, but things that you might be able to integrate into your own evaluation practice, even though it's design. Remember, same kind of thing. All right, how does this all fit? So for me, UX evaluation refers to the use of user experience design methods for the purpose of evaluating products or programs. These methods can be used either for a process evaluation or an outcomes evaluation. Most likely you're going to use it for more of a process or a developmental evaluation, if anybody is more aware of like the kind of beginning workings when you're just trying to get an evaluation, get a program up and running. And that's that startup mentality from a program perspective. So, but the idea behind it is that we're not changing the purpose of evaluation. We're just changing our overall perspective. So remember this: actions to consequences. Process evaluation if you're evaluating things related to actions. Outcome evaluation if you're evaluating things related to consequences. So a traditional evaluation is going to really be keyed into the overall intervention, the program, the thing that you're doing, and that's what you're evaluating. So that's what you're focused on. So people are going to be in the background. Yeah, there are always people involved. You might be sending people surveys to get their input, other ideas. Eventually, the outcomes are probably people-based. But in terms of what you're doing when you're looking at an evaluation is you're really keyed into what is that intervention? What are the actions, the consequences? How do these two things connect? Is it working? Does it work compared to other action consequence pairs? It's based on compared to a control group. If you're doing an RCT, if you're doing something else, how does one lead to the other? So you're really keyed in on that. Now, there's also participatory methods, contribution, participation, empowerment evaluation. Now, these are a little bit different, but our focus is still on the intervention itself. The difference is that we try to engage the people that we're working with and bring them into the overall process of designing that intervention, of the changes, of the actions and consequences, the things that they're going to be more heavily involved in evaluating the program and helping you understand what that program is, what it's doing, because you're kind of bringing them in to be a part of the overall process. But it still mirrors the traditional evaluation in terms of what we focus on. Now, for me, I think UX evaluation is different. I think UX evaluation is really, we're trying to change the spotlight. So instead of looking at just the intervention, we need an intervention, interventions, the activities, programs, things that we're trying to accomplish, they're all still a part of this. But what happens if we change our focus? If instead of looking at the intervention, we look at the experience of the people that we're trying to serve, the people that we're trying to help, and we see our program from their perspective. And that's what I think is the value in using these types of methods in an evaluation context. So I think it's really most helpful when the participant experience is most important, when innovating or tweaking activities, during times of big context changes, virtual programs or activities, evaluating websites, dashboards, and software. When it's not, when the intervention is fixed, when we're not doing a lot of changing, when we're not actually going to change the intervention, we just want to see if it works. If followed by fidelity, the UX approach, probably not the way to go. When people are expecting a traditional evaluation and they're the ones who are funding you, or they're the ones who are supporting the evaluation, telling you to do a traditional evaluation, you do a traditional evaluation, you don't change up everything unless people are on board. And when your program is not people focused, okay, if we're trying to reverse global warming, it's not a people focused initiative somehow. If we're looking at other indicators and change, and it's not so much a user kind of focused initiative, then it's not as useful. And but we'll go through a process. So what I'll do is I'll share some of my pieces, but I want you to think about your own programs, and we're going to dive back into this. And I'm going to ask you questions about your own programs, and I want you to start thinking through your own programs as if you're thinking through a user's perspective. So again, changing your mindset, changing your approach, not changing the goal of an evaluation. The first step is really this whole action consequence pair. Like, we need to understand what it is we're doing. Now, it's possible you already have a logic model and that can stand in for that, as long as you can think through it that way. If you have a logic model, if you have a theory of change, if you've done some program design work in understanding how the program is set up, how it's supposed to work, that's what you need in the beginning. Now, you can break this down really to a really finite, a really small level. So I can evaluate a website for a program where the website is only a very small part of the overall program, or a resource site, or a social media campaign, or these types of things can be evaluated. The actions and consequences are going to be based on what you're trying to accomplish with that campaign. So if you're trying to get people to register to take a webinar, so they take a webinar and they improve their skills, they learn something new, that would be the consequence, the action. Okay, what are you doing to try to get them into the webinar? I'll give you an example. So one of my projects is the American CDC, Centers for Communicable Disease. I work on an opioid data to action program, helping to develop an evaluation community of practice for them. And with that evaluation community of practice, we're trying to connect 66 different jurisdictions, many of which are US states. Some are smaller jurisdictions, regions, certain places that have issues with opioid use and that sort of thing. And the consequence is that we're trying to increase peer-to-peer learning between evaluators in different jurisdictions. So it's a peer-to-peer community of practice What we're trying to do is develop this community of practice and connect those different jurisdictions as a way to eventually increase their learning between them, between people within the different jurisdictions, to give them another connection, another way that they can boost their skills. That's not just turning to the CDC and asking them for help. So that's my intervention and concept. Has anyone else thought any more about their own work, and what it is that they might do, even if it's a small level?
Can I ask a question?
Please do.
Because what it seems to be missing here is the intervention, then the action is the process. So it would be whether there is that reach, whether you've, connected with the 66 jurisdictions, and then the outcome would be whatever outcomes that you've set for the intervention. So what I see your intervention is something like a community of practice, like the creating a community practice. Your action would be whether that community, whether it was in fact created, and the reach of it, whether like how many jurisdictions you might have reached, what is the number of members, something like that, whether there's some sort of like leadership advice, like, whatever you would set process goals for, or process objectives for the intervention, and then the consequences of the intervention probably are multidimensional. Like, it's increasing peer-to-peer learning, but I think that there would probably be other goals for the intervention in terms of even better able, like ability to respond, or increase knowledge, increase connection, increase sharing of information, like things like that. So that's where I kind of, when you're looking at, when I'm looking at your program design model, I don't see a differentiation between, the intervention itself, the program itself, and specific objectives related to its process or implementation and the outcomes.
I think just on this program itself, a little bit of additional context is we do have a traditional model in terms of evaluation, in terms of outcomes, outputs, outcomes, theory of change. We have certain set parameters for the overall program. And in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, when I oversimplify, it's really what I'm trying to do is just really to break it down to a really fine level, just so that I can have a conversation about it, even to people who are not engaged with the program at the time. But having that background, having the increased understanding, the challenge is that when programs are getting up and running, they don't always have all those pieces of information. I think it's worthwhile to go in to develop a program model to follow these kind of structures and the evaluation approach, such as the evaluation approaches that are put out by YouthREX in terms of how to go about developing that plan. But here, the idea is that, yeah, the actions really we're developing community of practice, and what are the goals of a community of practice? So that we can connect the states so that they have other learning partners. That's why the CDC funded the initiative. It's an oversimplification, but the idea is just so that we have something in mind so that we can jump into the next spots. Does that make sense? Or are we still on different wavelengths here?
No, I see what you're trying to do, but I would normally think like separate. I would think that there would be objectives for the community of practice before you even were looking at their impact. I would think an objective for the development of community practice would first be, did you reach those jurisdictions? The number, the
I
more process-oriented outcomes
I
before you
hear
would even
you,
look at the impacts.
but if you're not discussing why you're doing it in the first place, what is the reason that you're connecting people? You're just creating something. If you don't have the outcomes in your mind, or even perceived outcomes, or even the basic idea of what the outcome might be, yes, I could connect 66 OOT 2A jurisdictions. The community of practice normally would run, how they would normally do it is to develop a community by saying, okay, we're going to connect all these. Can you get all 66 jurisdictions to attend community of practice webinars? But attending webinars and being connected as peer-to-peer, as a peer-to-peer learning community are two different things. Now, from a process perspective, I can get that process evaluation to be perfect, but not even really head towards the outcomes the desired outcomes, without being able to have those in mind when I'm doing the design stuff. So I understand I think the approach that you're laying out is definitely a valid, tried and true evaluation approach. I think it's a traditional evaluation approach, and I think it's useful to approach evaluation, especially for a good number of programs. But I do think there is a way that we can borrow some of the like, okay, let's oversimplify a little just so we can get to the next step, so that we can dive in and start thinking about the outcomes in a little bit different way. And so what I'm hoping for today is just to kind of give you a little bit different of an approach that doesn't do that. But not saying that the approach that you're suggesting, Aline, is not valid, because I do believe it is. Does that make sense?
No, I'm listening. It's okay. Like I just, I guess I'm presenting more of a traditional approach, because when I'm seeing how are you even going to look at there's increased learning between, like in peer-to-peer learning between evaluators in different jurisdictions, if you haven't collected data on what jurisdictions are even being represented in terms of the community of practice.
Well, let's walk forward and we'll see how it goes, and then we'll talk about it after we go through the approach. So I'll show you what I have in mind, and in just a second. All right. So Henry said we're jumping back to some action consequence pairs. Ask youth how to better engage them and learn a new method of engagement. So if your approach, your whole goal is to learn new methods of engagement, you're talking about asking youth. The consequence that you're probably going after is to increase engagement with youth. Henry, if you're, instead of just learning new methods, it's not the result of a survey, but you're actually trying to better engage with youth in general. So maybe it's a new method, maybe it's an old method, but it's the method that works better for them. And so you have the action, usually you're leading towards some kind of consequence like that. Marnie, action, provide summer camp programs for youth who are entering mental health day program in the fall. Consequence, youth are more comfortable with the treatment center staff, making the formal program less intimidating. Okay, awesome. So yeah, so it's a way to give them a taste of the overall program so that they're more comfortable when it comes time for the formal program. All right, so that's only step one. And it's really just to have some kind of background context. Now, Alina, to your point, if you have more information, understand your intervention better, you're going to be better off. It's going to be easier to jump into all of this stuff. Doing a traditional evaluation approach is going to help with this kind of thing. But I think there's a reason to jump into, this is really where the UX design part starts. Before, you would usually start with a design challenge or an evaluation challenge, and that could potentially be where the starting point should be. I kind of tweaked it for this, but Starting with an understanding what you're trying to do is useful. The next is to think about the people that you're trying to serve. Who are the people within your overall group? And how are they going to approach the thing that you're trying to create? So remember my community of practice. So we created avatars or personas of like three different basic types of people who would be involved in the community of practice. So there are 66 jurisdictions, but there could be any number of evaluators in these jurisdictions. Some are junior, some are senior, and we also have a good number of epidemiologists who see themselves as kind of somewhat different groups here. And so a junior evaluator has some experience working within public health and evaluation. They're looking for opportunities to support their career growth, both as learners and presenters, often very well educated. There are a number of them who are just thrown right into the deep end in terms of, okay, COVID came along, we have this program to implement, we only have so much time and energy and staff. So they were just kind of jumped right in. And also as the new technology shift, they were kind of being pushed, having this kind of technical piece pushed onto their plate. This is just a way to, personas are just a way to really kind of dive into your different stakeholders and think through, why are they a part of this overall network? So we found when talking about our program to think about the people that we're trying to reach that are within these different jurisdictions, these 66 jurisdictions. The junior evaluator, the senior evaluator, the epidemiologist are the ones that we came up with. This was in collaboration, going through having discussions both with evaluators within the group, some senior evaluators that we had as part of an advisory group, the team lead on the CDC side to come up with the kind of ideas. Who are the people that are going to be reached? And so I guess as you're thinking, one of some of the ways to do this is just to do it really, really simply at first, but then to build out and to try to get a vision of who are these people that you're trying to engage with. So in Henry's case, who are the actual people? So when we're talking about reaching out to youth, what youth? Who are these youth? Where are you finding these youth? What are some aspects? Could you describe one or a group or an individual that might be across a number of different program sites? But can you get specific enough? One of the challenges that we find in the evaluation field is that we tend to generalize our audiences pretty quickly. And all of a sudden you have this kind of large Frankenstein's audience where it's just a bunch of bits and pieces of all these other things that all come together. And this webinar will be recorded. So if anybody has to miss it, at least it's being recorded and it will be shared too. So thank you, Eileen. Now I'm curious, and if anyone, I hope you're trying the activities at home, even if you're not sharing them, but go ahead and try to think through a person that would be kind of engaged in your program, somebody that you would be trying to reach. Try to give them a name, try to give them a profile. Like if you're talking about these people, who are they? And if you would be willing to share, I would be grateful to hear it because it's useful to talk through actual projects. All right, okay. Go ahead, Simran.
Hi, so I'm thinking of a young individual, so a youth, but are you asking me to be specific or more of a population?
Be specific.
Okay.
Name me like and you can go even so far as to put an individual in your head and try to just generalize around who that person is, or give them a fake name, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So a young girl involved in the justice system, so around, let's say 15, fake name Mary. And I think their motivation is to get rid of their youth record
Okay.
and work with their lawyer in the justice system to get the best outcome and you know, deal with the consequences, if that makes sense.
It does. Has something just happened to them that put them, or is this something that they're
Yes.
dealing with that is something from the past, or is this a new thing and they just don't want to see it
New
see it
thing.
hit their lives? It's a new thing. They're facing the justice system because of something that happened.
Mhm.
So they're motivated. They're really hoping to not have this kind of hit their record. Could I ask you a little bit about your program?
Yeah, so it is inspired by I run a gang intervention program, so it is inspired by the youth that I work with.
Gang intervention program. And is this and when you work with this program, it's to kind of help the kids or the youth who are facing the criminal justice system, to give them better outcomes so they have other opportunities outside of
Yeah.
gangs and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so a lot of skill building around goal setting, communication, problem solving, employment and stuff, so that yes, they can, as you said, um, either deal with the justice system or and have options outside of it as well.
Right. To follow an alternative path to maybe a more problematic one that could be in their future. So that's what you're doing. Okay. And then we meet Mary. Oh, that's great. I have a vision of the person that you're talking about. And cool. Thank you. That was useful, Simran. Thank you for that.
No problem.
Any male or female, age 7 to 30, any race, unemployed, ward of the state. Henry, do you want to go into, can you get really specific? And just like Simran did, just talk about one person, one generic person, like given age. It could be a 15-year-old. There's a 7-year-old and a 30-year-old are going to be a little bit different in terms of how you're going to reach them, how you're going to get in touch with them, the experience that you're going to have with them. So sometimes it's good to kind of narrow the band a little bit, just so that you can have more focus. Okay, somebody aged 24. So a 24-year-old is very different now. So we have a 24-year-old. Their unemployed 24-year-old is a little bit different than an unemployed 7-year-old. Most 7-year-olds are unemployed. So age 24, okay. Now the 7-year-old is entirely different situation here. Cool. So you can see sometimes getting into this persona building, and there are a lot of tools out there and a lot of methods that use persona, especially in the user experience design, human-centered design, because it gives us a way to really thoughtfully think through the people that we're serving with our program in a way that doesn't generalize or become overly generic, which is somewhat of a challenge for evaluators in general, especially when we're looking across entire systems or large programs. So sometimes just having a set of avatars or personas based on real people can be really useful in your evaluation. But now let's walk into the next step. Scenarios. So now that you have a person, you have a basic thing that you're doing, you have a person. Well, how will that person experience your program? And this is another part where we're going to get really specific. here are things that might go into your overall kind of scenario. Who are your program users, including their knowledge base and skill sets? What goals do they want to achieve? Some of these are already kind of in our persona. Okay, what must they do to reach those goals? How will they encounter your program? Where will they engage with the program? And what can get in their way or stop them from joining? So in Simran's case, we're talking about Mary. Well, let me talk about my own program first. So our junior evaluator is interested in connecting with their peers and improving their evaluation skills. They were added to an email list for this community and heard about it from their CDC contact on the evaluation team. Their work keeps them busy, but if the topic is interesting and there is no major conflict, they can budget an hour a month for a webinar. They'll need to know about the webinar at least a couple weeks in advance so they can put it in their schedule. That is, as long as it's not boring and just a bunch of lectures. Mostly, they would like to hear about what their peers are doing and see if they can get any takeaways. So sometimes your scenarios are based on actual interviews with real life users, your insight into the overall program based on your experiences with that program, or your inside knowledge about the program. Understanding the internal motivations, but actually the story about what it is that they're willing to do, how they might come and engage. That's what you want to do with the user scenario. So what's one, Simran, are you willing to come back up and talk through a scenario for Mary?
Yeah.
So how would Mary get involved with your program in the first place?
So through their probation officer, let's say, for instance, a probation officer.
Okay, so their probation officer lets them know of your program because you're involved with so the probation officer tells them, okay, we know you have these concerns. There's this program. We're going to connect you with these people.
Yeah.
Does it happen within the within the courts, or does it happen afterwards?
Within.
Within.
Yeah.
Okay. So, why don't you walk through this scenario? So, how does Mary hear about your program, and what is her next step in terms of what is she going to need to do to kind of engage with your services?
So the PO hears about us because we reach out to them through emails. Then the PO informs Mary. Then Mary and the PO asks Mary if they're interested. If she says yes, then the PO forwards us her contact information and we set up just like a get to know you session, a short session to get to know each other. And then after that, they get involved in the program.
Interesting. So just from that, I can see that your kind of outreach with your probation officer is really important.
Yes.
Because they're the ones that are making the initial pitch to Mary that they should consider contacting you.
Yeah.
So do you give them certain information that they hand out to Mary, or is it just back and forth knowledge that you exist?
We give them flyers.
Flyers. So they have a flyer that they're going to give to Mary. And that gives a little bit more information. Probably they'll broach it in a different way. Are there other alternatives that they're giving to Mary at this time?
Maybe by the PO, but not by us.
Right, not by you, but by the PO, because the PO is the person who is at this kind of first level of engagement.
Yes.
So they're going to give your flyer. I'm curious if they're giving any other flyers too. And then based on the discussion that they have and the context that they have with you, they're going to put Mary involved. And then Mary's next step is going to be outreach to you. So the PO is not reaching out to you and saying, oh, we have this person, Mary, you should get in touch with her. It's
Oh.
the other way around. They're talking to Mary and saying, you should get in touch with this program.
Yeah.
Okay. And then it's going to be in Mary's court. So whether or not Mary goes ahead and follows through with the contact, and then that's going to be your next place, your first kind of touch point with Mary as a
Mm.
program.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So what we did right there is pretty much walking through the role play. So part of what we can do if we develop different personas and we different scenarios, we can role play the different scenarios with the different personas to test out and see how our program would work in those different situations. So even just walking through a scenario, so we have a basic scenario that here's how Mary gets connected with your thing. Because we have Mary and we have the scenario, we can role play it and see, okay, well, this is how Mary came to get to your services. These are the steps that are involved. So how do we have like really great kind of a collaboration with our different probation officers? I'm guessing different POs might send more people than others. So there's the PO relationship is probably really important for your program. The flyers that you hand out, the things that the incentive for the people coming into the program, these are all elements that are probably important things to think through in terms of improving your ability to both connect with individual youth coming into the program and then delivering a service that kind of just brings them in. And outside of that, are there other people, Simran, in your program that would come to your program in an entirely different way? Or is Mary's case really the kind of way in which somebody would come into your program?
No, there's other ways so that they can interact with the website, they can interact with our social media accounts.
Right. So you have these different things. So as evaluators, here the spot, there are different spots in this overall thing where we can put in some of our regular evaluation methods to learn more about participants. When we talk about focus groups or we talk about individual interviews or diaries and other places where we're trying to figure out, we're trying to go back and figure out how people get engaged, because that's going to help us inform how we approach our work. That maybe Mary's case is an outlier. It's not as much, or maybe Mary's case is one of the main ways. So talking to real people and finding out how they're coming through is another spot we can use within this whole set. So when I'm evaluating websites, which is the easiest one, it's the closest to traditional UX design. It tends to be really easy. You're just examining how people go through pages and how people connect with different servers, different things to download or get their name added to a list or register for a website. Those are very fine things, but get engaged as a program, get engaged with a program, like the path that they take. Sometimes it's harder to find a testing group or people who can test that kind of thing. But if you create the personas and create the scenarios, and then you can have a table where you talk through, okay, how is this individual person connecting with our program? And is that the way that most people connect to it, or are there other pathways? And these things are going to let you know what are your key activities, what are your key pieces that really connect people in. And then, so with testing groups or role-playing groups, you can think about your team members. If you just need a little feedback or you're short on time, you just want to talk through a certain scenario. If you go to non-users, people who might have an understanding of the overall project, but they don't really have a stake in your project, they can play through a situation. So if you give them, here's Mary's case, here's a scenario where she's going to be coming up in front. How would you, if you were in Mary's shoes, what would you do? And then there are actual users. So depending on what kind of program that you're putting through, if you can ask actual, if you're trying to reach 15-year-olds and lead them to a test prep program, and you're having trouble contacting them, well, having a getting online with a real 15-year-old that might be within the group and asking them to walk through a scenario might be, and you see that they get stuck with a hookup, like there's some kind of messed up part of your program in terms of where registration happens or how the timing goes, or maybe emails that get sent that need to change in order to improve the likelihood that they'll jump in. And that's kind of how you do a testing thing. These are just a few of the methods, and usually with UX design or UX evaluation, the process that you pick, the different methods that you're going to cobble together are going to be based on the needs that you have with your specific project, and what you're trying to accomplish with that. But it's really about focusing not on what it is that your program is doing, but the experience of your program from an external point of view, not from a stakeholder's point of view. And then finally, it's just reporting. And that's the time to tell your story. Now, with my scenario before, I didn't really have to report because I was also designing. So I was kind of like really far into it where I could take the feedback and change. So we would create feedback loops where you would have these kind of conversations. So from a design perspective with UX design teams, often they have continuous meetings, they do continuous testing, and then they have a lot of feedback loops where they go in, they do testing, they improve, they do testing, they improve. Now, this isn't always possible for our programs. It's not really how they're always designed, but when we're trying to innovate or change, sometimes that's what you need to do. So, a few of the couple of the lessons that we learned with our program doing these kinds of feedback loops is that unstructured webinars really just don't work. So we had like, let's get together and spend an hour talking about the challenges. But we found it much easier, much more useful to have webinar panels where you have 3 or 4 different people from within the overall evaluation community come share results about their specific programs. That was way more useful for the people who are involved in our overall program. And then we had a virtual community site, a forum, that kind of thing. It wasn't that engaging, or people weren't really that engaged in it. Over time, it turned out that they're far more engaged if you just create a simply weekly blog. They're a little too overwhelmed and too much going on to really need that virtual community site. The audience was also not quite as big, so it just added more confusion. So those are a couple of things we learned in the first year and a half. Now, if this was another type of program where there's an external team or we need to get sign off to make any changes to an overall program, sometimes talking through the stories in terms of what we expected to happen when we're talking about a persona, where we're talking about a certain scenario, what actually did happen, and what lessons can we learn about what surprised us, what things went really well, what things didn't work at all, unforeseen challenges. These things can give us some really good insight as to how we can improve our programs to meet the needs of those specific individuals, and improve our overall program. And that's kind of what all of this is about. So here's some suggested resources. There's my site. I have a virtual workshop. Designkit.org has tons of methods. So I advocate going there. There's an nngroup.com. They're the Nielsen Norman group. They do a lot of research on user experience. So especially if you're doing like virtual programs, online sites, and you want to see kind of what are some of the best practices, what's some of the evidence around how people use the web, that's a good place to go. There's a lot of UX design articles out on the web. I just put one source there. There's software, but usually that's all around prototyping. So if you're doing any kind of web design, dashboard design, things that are virtual kind of projects, do that. I also have a little ebook out there. And again, all this will be shared. So please feel free to look at that. And then next week, we're going to talk about creative reporting. But now I just like to open it up to any questions that anybody has about any of this. And please feel free. And Katie, Kat, you can ask questions too.
I have a question if I can jump in. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Adrian.
Hey, thanks for sharing all that information. I found it to be really interesting. One thing that I'm maybe struggling a little bit with is the goal of our intervention or evaluation is to increase our participants. And so I can imagine personas of people who maybe we're trying to reach but aren't reaching our programs. And so you can kind of go through the part in that way. But I wondered if, if there's other ways that you could think about a problem like that, or if there's other kind of ways to move through this flow that you think that would be helpful for reaching participants who are not yet a part of your program.
And yeah, I think that is definitely the starting point, is to you're looking across your different personas, the people who are actively engaged and the people that you know are part of the overall audience that you want to try to reach out to, the expand into, but are not engaged. And really start narrowing down who those people are, because it's something that our traditional methods tend more to like, well, here are the number, we had 100 people show up, we'd love to have 150 people show up, is different from like, well, we're not reaching anybody within this specific community, or people 15, 16-year-olds, they're not coming to this, why is that? And then to have the conversations about that, and then to do the research and find people, like how, even just talking through the scenario. Like, do you want to talk through a scenario?
Sure.
Name somebody who you would like to reach that you don't think you're currently reaching.
Yeah, I would say like 16-year-old youth from a marginalized population who's only covered by public insurance.
Okay. And what is your program?
It's a mental health navigation service.
It's a mental health navigation service. And how would you expect that 16-year-old youth to find you?
Probably via our website or some school outreach that we've done, that sort of thing.
When you have other people who are involved in your program, how do they find you? The same way?
Yes, or through referrals from partner agencies.
Okay. Now, do you have an idea of how much your partner agency referrals mean to getting youth connected with your program?
A small sense, really. The main way, I guess, that we reach people is through the caregivers, and so parents reaching out, and we're interested in increasing youth who reach out on their own.
Interesting. So the caregivers reaching out, and how are the caregivers finding you? Google?
Probably.
And have you explored the types of keywords or anything, or any of the ways in which they're finding you?
Yes, and I think that our evaluation kind of has indicated that we're successful in reaching caregivers, but we're not as successful in reaching young people. So, I mean, and they could Google the same thing, but for some reason, more caregivers are willing to reach out. My suspicion is that our issue is not in who is able to find us, but who's motivated to reach out once they do find us.
And the networks of people who, if you're the challenge with relying on different websites and Google and those kinds of things is that any kind of social media thing too, is that you're likely to find more of the same kind of people that you already find, because these things are the algorithms are geared to kind of give you more of the same. So when reaching out to different communities, my big question for you, I guess, would be, okay, so the caregivers of these people in these certain situations, but what about the caregivers of the people within marginalized communities? The 16-year-old in the youth in the marginalized community, are you not seeing their caregivers reach out? And if not, how might you be able to kind of create that same kind of flow for those caregivers? How can you do outreach to them?
Yeah, I see what you're getting at. I think maybe I'd have to like get much further into the into this scenario to make it work. And I know we have just a few minutes here, but
That's okay.
yeah, I think I got specific with that person of who we're reaching out to in the persona, but we're really interested in like youth of all backgrounds and all ages reaching out. So
And I think and my advice is usually pick some different champions in those different communities, different scenarios, different personas, and just have that thought exercise and walk through with the team or colleagues or advisors, and just see if you can walk through the scenario and learn some lessons. You'll usually figure out, okay, well, we're really missing this kind of thing, or there's really no reason this person is ever going to know we exist unless we do something else to get out to them. And then it's finding connection ways. But thank you, Adrian. That was useful.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited about this. I'll be back next week.
Awesome. All right, we're running out of time. Katie, sorry, called you Caddy again.
That's okay. No, thanks so much, Chris. If no one else has any questions, then we can end our session for today on time. As Chris mentioned, we will be back next Wednesday. So if you haven't had an opportunity to register, please do. And we're going to share in the chat box a link to a feedback form, so you can share your feedback from today's session. It always helps us to understand the consequences of our actions. And we will be able to make the slides and the recording available. They will be available on our website, and we'll also share the link as well to where on our website you'll be able to find that. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And we hope that we will see you back here next Wednesday.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone. Talk soon.
Bye.